Good morning, everyone. I am Shurosh Pal, an undergraduate student at the Department of English, Presidency, University, Kolkata. This session, parallel session 3, Dalit Feminism, Brahmanical, Patriarchy 1, will be chaired by Dr. Anandita Pan. Dr. Anandita Pan is an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, ISR Bhopal. She researches and publishes in the areas of feminist theory, gender studies, Dalit feminism, Dalit studies, and Bengal partition. She has published in journals such as Economic and Political Weekly, South Asian Review, Indian Journal of Gender Studies, Contemporary South Asia, and Contemporary Voice of Dalit. Her book, Mapping Dalit Feminism Towards an Intersectional Standpoint, Stage 3 2020, explores the ways in which different forms of discrimination combine and overlap, challenging the apparent homogeneity of the categories woman and Dalit as seen by mainstream Indian feminism and Dalit politics. It discusses at length the contributions of an intersectional standpoint in reorienting the existing epistemological frameworks of caste and gender. Over to you, ma'am.
Hello, Suroshri. Thank you so much for your, kind introduction. And I'm very excited to be part of this, wonderful conference, two-day conference. So, without further ado, I would invite the, four presenters. So, before we begin the papers, let me just remind you that you will have 20 minutes each for your presentations. And the way we are going to progress is we will go ahead with all the presentations first, and then we will take up all the question answers. And in between, if any of you have questions to the presenters, please feel free to write them in the chat box, which will be taken up by the end of the presentations, or you can directly ask questions also by the end of it. Okay, so we'll begin with the first paper of today's session, which is titled Myths and History, the Other Side of Dalit Feminist Activism. The paper will be presented by Ms. Aishanee Mallik. So Ms. Mallik has completed her graduation and post-graduation in history from Jadavpur University. Her area of research interest incorporates gender studies, Dalit studies, and understanding socio-cultural issues during colonial and post-colonial India. At the same time, she is interested in grappling with the notions and understanding surrounding the emerging Bhadralok culture and the contemporary politics in colonial India. Currently, she is pursuing a PhD in the proposed area of interest, myths in reconstructing a history of Santhal women in late colonial and post-colonial Bengal. Okay, over to you, Aishanee.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. But I am not currently pursuing a PhD. I am trying for a PhD.
Okay, great.
So shall I present my paper, ma'am?
Yes, Aishanee. You can start presenting. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, ma'am. Is it visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. A very good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor on my part to be a part of this two-day international conference being organized by the Department of English of the prestigious Presidency University, and to have received the golden opportunity of presenting my paper amidst so many established scholars and academicians. I humbly thank one and all of you personally to give me the scope of exploring myself and bringing my area of interest before you. My paper titled Myths and History, the Other Side of Dalit Feminist Activism is a search towards an alternative history, or to speak very minutely, a walk into a path which is not quite traversed or taken by. Now we have all grown up hearing a stereotypical notion that myth and history are two discrete entities, with one representing the hardcore, objective, unbiased facts and figures, and the other standing for figments of imagination, to put it in that way. We have been taught that there exists a watertight compartmentalization between myth on the one hand and history on the other. But this present paper would rather contradict and challenge this standpoint, and going to show how myths and legends are actually embedded within history, generated by history, produced by history, so much so that in addition to other concrete source materials, myths and legends too can constitute as an important source material for reconstructing history. And in this way, the dominant overwhelming narrative would be thrown open to question, whereby we would ultimately realize how the meanings embedded and encrypted within the everyday lived in creations and articulations made by the Dalit women. For instance, by studying their folk songs, their dance forms, their paintings, tattooings, and anthologies, would actually give us a concrete idea about their history of resistance, both against Brahmanical hegemony and patriarchal oppression. At yet another level, they will rescue them from the typical encapsulation from the image as silent sufferers and being co-opted by the dominant caste society. Let us see how. Historian Charu Gupta, in one of her books, The Gender of Caste, makes a very pertinent argument. She points out that the problem with most of the conventional historiographical notions is that they tend to revolve between two extreme viewpoints. Either they present the Dalit woman as a silent sufferer, a passive agent of ageless endurance, or they go on to show how much she is the degenerate, adulterous, and fallen vamp woman. So the dominant imageries which emerge surrounding the Dalit women is that either they are the potentially victimized vulnerable beings or they are the sexually promiscuous, utterly lascivious vamp individuals. The similar kind of argument rings in different overtones in Sharmila Rege and Deboshide's work. In one of her articles by Rege titled A Dalit Feminist Standpoint, she points out that the problem with most of the feminist movements of the late 1970s and 80s was that they came to be collectively led by women folk of upper caste, middle class, and elite backgrounds. And accordingly, it was these women's experiences which came to be universalized as quote-unquote women's experiences. In other words, in the name for a collective solidarity that women essentially connected with other women, the call for a Dalit woman to speak on her behalf got whitewashed and silenced out, thereby disallowing, in the words of Rege, a distinct Dalit feminist discourse to successfully emerge. Similarly, Deboshide points out that either through a conscious or unconscious process of co-option, the Dalit women are constantly getting mainstreamized within the dominant caste societies. And what is this generating, according to they, is creating a cultural silence or a cultural memocide. That is a very killing out and silencing out of the modalities of resistance of a particular community. Now, at the same time, it was precisely during the colonial period that the real battle for ideal upper caste womanhood came to be waged, as we all know. And this came to be waged within the four walls of the home. Having come to be grappled by the rigors and toil of colonial labor, coupled with the grinding clock time, the natural tendency on the part of the men folk was to shift the entire issue upon the women folk and their bodies in particular. Hence, it was the home which reflected and represented the last yet uncolonized space, in the words of renowned and notable historian Tonika Sarkar. At the same time, we find the only possible solution was to shift the entire trope by building upon the rhetoric of quote-unquote ideal women and invocating and re-invocating mythical figures of Sita and Savitri as ideal mothers and devoted wives, and ascribing the ideal roles of women to follow the Pativrata norms of the society. And just as the ideal woman was to follow the path laid down for Sita Savitri, the fallen woman rhetoric, on the other hand, would incorporate such women who dare to transgress the public-private dichotomy, according to notable historian Partho Chatterjee's conceptualization. And accordingly, mythical invocation of non-ideal figure of the vamp Shurbanakha came to be brought in. And this vamp imagery came to be invariably associated with the bodies of the Dalit women folk, because the Dalit women, out of extreme poverty and financial constraints, had to work outside the home. But what these mythical invocations signify is that a deep underlying patriarchal anxiety as well as a conquering societal tension existed at that time. Hence, we find how myths were actually intertwined with history, and mythical invocations did not remain sheer figments of imagination, but actually signified a very real historical situation, the built-in patriarchal anxieties of that time. Ruth Manorama, an activist of Women's Voice, a slum-based mass organization in Bangalore, and an active participant in Christian Dalit liberation movement, untiringly brings out the cause of the Dalit women by referring to them as thrice alienated in terms of gender, caste, and class. The Dalit woman, owing to the fact that she belongs to the weaker sex, is being humiliated and subjected to multiple forms of sexual abuses and ill treatments like rapes, gang rapes, sexual harassments, and molestations by menfolk of the upper castes and communities, as well as by the menfolk of our very own community. At another level, the Dalit woman is being subjected to humiliations because of the fact that she is a socially quote unquote untouchable individual. Accordingly, abuses and atrocities meted out by both the menfolk and womenfolk of the upper castes and communities are an everyday phenomenon. At yet another level, we do find, in terms of our financial marginalization and poor class position, the Dalit woman is being marginalized and forcible manual scavenging and manual labor emerge as the dominant pictures which are being meted out by the well-to-do and established classes and communities. And it is in this context that Manorama visualizes the triple plight of the Dalit woman. And all these three lenses of gender, caste, and class operate conjointly at one common axis, the axis of power politics. Coming to the concrete manifestations of the social reality, we find these two grotesque representations, one in the form of a newspaper clipping and the other in the form of a crude statistical report portraying the gruesome picture that 10 Dalit women are raped on a daily basis in our country. Yes, that's the ugly reality. Everyday news and reports of brutalities and crimes against Dalit women are inescapable. In one column named Unheard Voices, a report came out, namely the report on the Dalit women for the 70th session of Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the report vividly shows us how Dalit women face multiple modes of oppression which violate their economic, social, educational, and cultural rights. And occasionally, from times and again, several reports have brought forth a crude reality before us that although the Dalit woman is usually being portrayed as a polluting agent, it is not a problem when the point is to extract labor from her. Likewise, in the case of rape as a social revenge, the Dalit woman becomes socially quote-unquote touchable in more ways than one. But what these reports did not bring to fore was the equally true reality that despite being oppressed and humiliated, the Dalit women did inherently and inevitably produce an alternative language of resistance and dissent. And one way in which they have reflected and generated their own modalities of resistance is by producing and generating myths and legends, the meanings of which, when decoded, would actually show us the concrete historical scenarios. Now, we have already looked at how the entire revivalist nationalist rhetoric shifted the trope on the women of the household and their bodies in particular. Since there was a kind of a reality that a languor and sluggishness had crept in within the bodies of the Bengali men, they came to be mocked upon with terms like effeminate Bengali babus with invirile frail masculinities, to go by Mrinalini Sinha's terminologies. Hence, there existed a subterranean anxiety on one level or the other that howsoever they wanted, the Bengali Bhadralok could not outrightly deny that they had been grappled by the forces of colonization, and some kind of a masculine culture had to be inculcated within them. In one book by Norman Cohn titled Europe's Inner Demons, Cohn intricately helps the reader to grapple with an ugly social reality. And this reality was none other than the one surrounding the numerous accusations and witch hunts in medieval Europe. Cohn untiringly shows us how the very society of Europe, grappled with their own anxieties and crises, ultimately shifted the entire trope through innumerable witch hunt accusations, and hence the name of his book, Europe's Inner Demons. Likewise, within the Indian context too, to keep the fragile public-private dichotomy intact, the entire rhetoric and trope shifted upon the bodies of the women of the home. As a natural corollary, the subsequent mythological invocations of Sita and Savitri as ideal women to be venerated and emulated, to the devilish vamp Shurpanakha, to the vulnerable meek Shabori reflected nothing, but exposed Bengal's own anxiety of the inability to handle and face the reality, once again reconfirming that these mythological invocations in reality highlighted the social need of the hour, the need to whitewash the reality. as I started my paper off with, I have mentioned how myths and legends are to the popular eye depicted as figments of imagination. Now we are going to interrogate whether they're really stories for sheer entertainment purpose, or do they reflect upon concrete historical realities. In one of her articles in her own right, noteworthy scholar and historian Uma Chakraborty delves into how the Dalit women of a particular community, led by a Dalit girl Viramma, actually utilize the myth of the Kali Yuga in their own ways by inverting the very meaning encrypted within the Kali Yuga in an alternative fashion. In stark contrast to the popular conceptualization that the Kali Yuga stands as an age of upheaval and normlessness, to Viramma and the womenfolk of her community, the Kali Yuga actually demonstrated and symbolized a period of emancipation and enlightenment, because that was the time when the Dalits, and particularly the Dalit women, had access to education, sanitation, and healthcare facilities. Hence, this mythical alternative invocation cannot be dismantled as sheer fiction, in the words of Chakraborty, because it reflected the ability of Viramma and the womenfolk of her community to stand and speak up for themselves without drawing on or borrowing the mainstream community. At the same time, it did reflect their modalities of resistance against both Brahmanical hegemony as well as against patriarchy. The second illustration you can see is surrounding the myth of Chalkari Bai. In stark contrast to the usual perception that the revolt of 1857 has come to be led by traditional elite leaders of the society like Begum Hazrat Mahal or Tatya Topi or Rani Lakshmibai, to the Dalit narrative in general and to the Dalit feminist narrative in particular, it was the Dalit Viranganas like Chalkari Bai, Udadevi and Avantibai Lodi who were the ones who were actually the leaders and instrumental in valiantly fighting the Britishers and helping us gain independence, while leaders like Lakshmibai were busy saving their own thrones and honor. And accordingly, we do find popular tracts, plays, comic books, and Notankis, and even organizations and monuments constructed in their names, so much so that this cannot be rubbished out as figments of imagination. Bajranarayan points out that we cannot deny this as sheer figments of imagination because this was encrypted within a very concrete historical event and a reality, which is none other than the revolt of 1857. And secondly, Chalkari Bai was as real a historical character as Lakshmibai was. And in this context, Charugupta throws open a very pertinent question before the readers, that how authentic and real are official canonized representations of the 1857 revolt? The third illustration you can see is of the Godna painting practiced by the Dalit women in the Madhubani district of Bihar. In his article, Laboring Intellectuals, Gopal Guru brilliantly talks of how, in the Godna paintings and tattooings, the Dalit women invested their artistic skill into transforming the everyday toilsome monotonous labor into artistic self-expression. But the historical reality behind this mythical invocation was that the Dalit women were actually forced to wear ornaments of raw inferior metals. But through these paintings, the Dalit women produced and expressed an alternative voice of resistance against upper caste hegemonic ideologies. Hence, we find how in multiple ways Dalit women have risen up and have devised alternative voices of dissent, right? Viramma's alternative mythological invocation of the meaning encrypted within the Kali Yuga to the myths of Udadevi, Avantibai Lodi and Chalkari Bai circulating in northern and central India as oral popular narratives, ranging to several literary and artistic creations and articulations, bring before us the other side of history, the voices of dissent not usually taken account of. A Dalit woman writer, Kumud Pawade, in one of her novels, Antaspot, expresses how she rose up being a Mahar woman and produced her own modalities of resistance. A Marathi journal, Parivartanacha Vatsaru, led by two Dalit feminist writers, Urmila Pawar and Pradnya Pawar, has recently brought forth the debate on Dalit feminist sexuality, which is certainly a very positive sign. Till now, we have looked at how the rhetoric of the Dalit women emerged in colonial and post-colonial India. We have also come to see the socially deep-rooted underlying anxieties and the constant fear of patriarchy to keep its position intact. Now, both patriarchy and caste politics have remained two ugly realities till date. Now, times and again, new definitions and redefinitions have been brought forth regarding what history is and what comes to constitute it. While some scholars have ascribed the objective, unbiased path shown by Leopold von Ranke as the ideal one for a historian, others have left it to the discretion and perspective of the fellow historian. Perhaps I feel we cannot arrive at one single middle position because variegated opinions and arguments shall continue to thrive so long as history continues to breathe. But what probably appears is that now time has arrived to acknowledge and recognize the many voices of history, to borrow historian Romila Thappar's phrase. Accordingly, alternative dissident voices can and do exist comfortably along with hardcore factual realities without any clash. Therefore, let the search for truth be a wholehearted and a never ending process. Thank you, one and all, for your patience and kind listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aishanee, for finishing, keeping within the time. We will take up all the questions by the end of all the presentations, okay?
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Aishanee. And I'll also provide my comments at the end only. So next paper we have is by Shashi Sikriwal. Shashi will be presenting a paper which is titled Voices of Subaltern Women, a study of the Bandit Queen of India in the dynamics of gender and caste violence. So Shashi is currently pursuing PhD from the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi. So over to you, Shashi. You have 20 minutes.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. Good morning to the page chairperson, all the paper presenters and audiences. I, Shashi Sikriwal, pursuing PhD from the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi. I feel honored to be part of this conference as a paper presenter, and my paper is based on Voices of Subaltern Women, a study of the Bandit Queen of India in the dynamics of caste and gender violence. The presentation of every community in literature can be seen as a political activity. Well, the traditional and the classical Indian literature are not only neglected the voice of lower rank and powerless classes in the name of equilibrium of society and the concept of totality, but somehow they only sympathize with oppressed classes in their depictions. The portrayal of modernity in 20th century literature has disturbed the singularity in language and art and contributed to evolving the working class and marginalized literature. The current literature is a domain of struggles and conflicts of social and historical realities. The recitation of certain segments in the literature, be it gender, class, or caste, have been connected with a particular ideology and set of ideas. In this way, the literature gains control of the genre of autobiographical writing as it reflects their personal and therefore most authentic experiences. Dalit women also made use of their memoir as it opened the platform and chance to provide shreds of evidences of their personal experiences in print, and such narration of their own subjectivity witness them as victims of oppression and makes Dalit women spectator of undergone experiences as being a Dalit and women within their own community. In this context, there is a necessity for the diversity of perspective to become the broader and reshape the scholarly pedagogies in Indian literature. The use of the autobiographical genre required more critics to go beyond the classical genre of literature in order to perceive the personal experiences of the marginalized community, which can make more sense to the upper castes toward the understanding of the pain of Dalit existence and their undergoing experiences. The biography of legendary Phulan Devi is narrated by Susan Dia, who was working for Robert Laffont, a French publisher. Phulan Devi recounted her story to Susandia, and the writers Mary Thiercy Kenny and Paul Rambali shaped the draft of life from the beginning to till her life ends. She lived for 38 years and became an icon of attraction for nationally and internationally. Phulan Devi, famously known as the Bandit Queen of India, was born in remote village in Uttar Pradesh in a family of Malla, a lower caste according to the Hindu caste system. As Sarah Sindhu Thomas notes, the unique stratification of Indian society is based on the ritual of purity that follows the caste system, a four-tiered structure which keeps the Brahmin at the top and Shudra at the bottom in the caste system. This way, Dalits occupied the lowest position in the social hierarchy. Consequently, they obtained the auxiliary position of the proletarians and untouchables, which remained them at the margins of the society. In this complicated scenario, the situation of Dalit women also found themselves as a double oppressed, as a women and as a Dalit. This double marginalized position also intentionally accorded them in literature too, which ultimately forwarded Dalit women to narrate their own life incidents. In this context, Pulan Devi says, quote, "Now for the first time, a woman from my community has been able to tell the truth about her life and testify in public to the injustice we all had to suffer. It was my hope that my testimonial would give help others and other women, my sisters who have been humiliated." Unquote. Her testimony is related to the margins of the literature along with various subjects of Dalit women. Her memoir becomes the voice of evidences where she speaks collectively for the exploited group that remained silently for ages. Phulan Devi's biography, The Bandit Queen of India, an Indian women's amazing journey from peasant to international legends, narrates that Phulan was married at the age of 11 to a named Puttilal, who is 20 years older than her. Her childhood was totally traumatized as the village children criticized her as the old man's wife. One day she was accidentally broke an earthen pitcher, and in response she was raped, molested and tortured by her husband. She ran away many times to her marital home, but returned by her parents, and each time to be punished by her husband as a raped. Later, she ran back to her marital home and she started working with her parents. In rural areas, leaving their husband is considered a serious taboo, and for that reason, Pulan became an outcast. Being a single woman, she was approached by Sarpanch Ashok, who tried to rape her. After escaping herself, Ashok made his own descriptions about her character, which turned her life into more painful. She was raped by policemen in prison. Later, she was kidnapped by the Babu Gujar, a dacoit, who tried to rape her, but Vikram Mallai, another gang member, helped her. She joined gang with him, and after the death of Vikram Malla, she was raped by another dacoits known as Sri Ram and Lala Ram, who extremely beat her, raped her by one. She narrates like, quote, "I did not know what village we were in. I did not know how many hours had been, how many days and nights. 4 or 5 times at least we went from one village to another, and each time I was paraded naked in front of villagers. Each time Sri Ram called me Mallavor, I said I was one who had killed Vikram, and hurling me to the ground, told the villagers to use me as they pleased. They fell on me like vowels. They dragged me and picked me up. I saw crowds of faces, and I was naked in front of them. Demons came without end from the fires of Naraka to rape me. My body was covered in blood and bruises." Unquote. According to the Root Manorma, president and founder of National Federation of Dalit Women, says such type of violence are conventionally reserved for Dalit women. The utmost filthy vocal abuses, sexual nicknames, nude parading, mutilation, pulling out their nails, tongue, teeth, violence such as murder after declaring them witchcraft are only experienced by Dalit women. These Dalit women are threatened by rape as a part of combined bloodthirstiness by the upper castes. In this sense, the root of modern Indian society is based not about inequality or poverty or lack of opportunity, but rather an exploitation and sexual violence of Dalit women. It is not the poverty and education Fulan's situation, it is an enslavement of the sexuality of Dalit women for the higher caste. According to the Sarmila Reg, in 1995, the development of a National Federation of Dalit Women raised many scholars and activities who discussed about the Dalit women to talk differently from the perspective of Dalit women's experimental authority and along with the Dalit women movement. This federation emerged the need of Dalit feminist standpoint, which can raise the overlapping categories of caste, class, gender, and ethnicities. Gopal Guru, in his essay Dalit Women Talk Differently, says Dalit women justifies the case talking differently on the basis of external factors and internal factors. He talks about the identity-based association, where Dalit women narrate their experiences based on gender and caste oppression. He said the cultural and political marginalization of Dalit men due to the dual patriarchy faced by them. Secondly, they are ignored by mainstream Indian feminism. In this way, Dalit feminists raise their own voice that are different from Dalit men and other women. According to the Anandita Pan, as she is our chairperson in her book, in her book Mapping Dalit Feminism, she says the era of the 1990s is supposed to be the rise of independence on various issues, and the autonomous Dalit women organizations like All India Dalit Forum in 2006 and the National Federation Dalit Women in 1995 developed a specific feeling about the Dalit women that they need to be categorized themselves with special problems and needs. These special problems and needs signify the difference in the situation between the Dalit men and the upper caste women. This expressed that it forced to recognize the necessity of difference among Dalits and women. Like Phulan, the case of Bhavri Devi, a lower caste woman working with Sathin NGO, faced sexual violence while going against child marriage. The scholars Anand Tamde and Anupma Rai analyzed the other two cases. One is based on the Sirsagaon incident in 1963 and including four Dalit men striking and parading, and the other is Khelanji's in 2006 gang rape and massacre of Dalit family shows how the Dalit and justice system conspire against Dalit women to decline the evident role of sexualized violence in sustaining caste order. This institution tries to silence the voice of Dalit women and illustrate the social script of silence sexual violence in such a way where Dalit women are left as pawns in the societal struggle of men. In this way, after the surrender of the Phulan, the media person described her as a wildcat or mad woman. This media is myth-making machine that tries to harm a reputation of Phulan Devi and present a negative image of her. The subjectivities of Phulan are erased from the narrative of sexual violence. The media generates confusion and creates double moves while explaining her sometimes as a violent agent and sometimes calling her an abject woman. Later, the editorial of the Hindu newspaper highlighted that she turned herself into violence because she was brutalized by violence. According to the Kishwar, the Hindu newspaper works especially to uncover the myth of the romantic fantasy and unveil the real story of Phulan Devi. The Hindu newspaper rejects the other account and only endorses the biography as the reality and uses it to elucidate Phulan's for its reader. The editorial tries to handle the perplexity that is constructed by Phulan's iconicity by using the rape revenge formula. This editorial can be seen as one of the different journalistic accounts with other headlines such as A Life Less Ordinary by Indian Express, The Legends of Wronged Women by Telegraph, a bullet-riddled biography by Outlook. The Outlook magazine stated in its cover story, the Phulan Devi possible never stood up. A under 5 feet, this rebel of ravines was essentially a sharp-tongued wronged woman. In other words, confusion emerged by emergences of Phulan Devi into the mainstream creates a sense of uneasiness because the media is myth-making machine which it should have to and creates its own myth was managed by illuminating to need to look at facts and accordingly by narrating Phulan as a oppressed woman who lied with a gun and last died by it. Indian Express. As seems, after coming the biography of Phulan Devi, news media worked to highlight the reality and formed transparency on her. The previous one is a romantic illusion, but later her story turned into a horrific tale of abuse, child marriage, and kidnapping. She suffers due to child marriage, lack of education, domestic violence, dual patriarchy, atrocities done to her family by upper caste people, gender violence, and discrimination at various stages of her life. Despite of all these struggles and conflicts faced by her, the resistance made her special. Phulan not only fought against the entire powerful system, but she refused to accept the stereotyped gender roles and gender behaviors assigned by society. She answered back, rebelled, and stood alone provoking the patriarchal and powerful system. Through her biography, we came to know about several subaltern women who faced the atrocities and their stories never came into public. It is the only story of Bandit Queen the world knows. Her biography creates awareness of the subaltern women's inequalities that are naturalized and normalized. Her work has a great responsibility to go ahead by promoting equality and dismissing the biased tradition and custom. Fulan's evaluation through the biography can be seen as a powerless, battered, and submissive woman to an assertive, confident, and challenging woman. The banditry provides her with an opportunity to establish her identity and prohibition of discriminations. The real bandits are the Thakurs, Sarpanch, Pradhan who did not give wages to the laborers, the upper caste who robbed the self-respect and dignity of the oppressed, the police reacted according to the powerful and rich people, and the media fabricated news about her identity. The entire story of Fulan is not about her survival in the rural third world area, but she produced a consciousness and self-awareness. Through her autobiography, the reader encounters Fulan an abject victim. Moreover, since her childhood, she represents an angry subaltern woman who plans strategically for her decisive steps against the day-to-day oppressions which she is forced to face. The two descriptions of her biography. Firstly, she is like an uncivilized, a frightened cat or wild animal, sick, nervous, and aggressive. And second, as a political leader, construct simultaneously change in identity. The transformation in identity changed her internally and externally. Her figure raised many questions from the mainstream media, which continuously searched for an explanation. Her story portrays the intersection between patriarchy and caste in everyday life in rural India. Apart from that, the testimonial constellations Fulan resistance as related to her opinion on social justice, her mother actions as Fulan's narrate, she was born with her mother's anger, her mother's struggle through socio-economic hierarchies in her everyday rural life compel Fulan to be rebellious. Such rebellion represents social oppression as a static feature in Indian culture. In this sense, the testimonial of Dalit women raised their voice against their captured, controlled, and incarnated bodies with the apparatus of hegemonic male domination and the social ladder of caste. Fulan Devi, Fulan Devi's tale of grit presents the sexual violence along with her transformation into an agent of vengeance. Her narrative covers a gigantic landscape of lived incident of oppressed women of the Dalit community, and from the Dalit women standpoint, the social cultural separation, sexual violence, and economic exploitation are the main reason for their daily life exploitation. At last, Fulan, by narrating her sufferings and pain, she not only construct a wisdom of awareness, but also free herself from the humiliations and agony and initiated her own way of liberation. Her rebellious awareness is based on idea of justice, equality, solidarity, and liberty. Her courage to highlight the rebelliousness and resoluteness against the dominant system of society and how her assertion challenged the numerous forms of suppression and outlined deliberate end to preserve her identity, dignity are the prominent part of her biography. Thank you.
Thank you, Shashi, for keeping to the time. We will take up questions by the end of the session. Now over to the next paper, Ms. Alakananda Ghatak. So Alakananda will be presenting a paper titled Voicing the Silenced, the Marginalized Other of the Brahmaputra Valley. Alakananda is currently pursuing her master's in English from Cotton University in Guwahati, Assam. She has completed her undergraduation with a major in English from B. Borua College, Guwahati, and her first MA in European Studies from Guwahati University. Her areas of interest include Northeast literature, Dalit theory, Indian literature, women's literature, cultural and post-colonial studies. Over to you, Alakananda. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible? Good morning, one and all present here. And at first, I would like to humbly thank you for this opportunity for
for providing me with this opportunity to speak at such an international level. I'd like to share the screen. Ma'am, is the screen visible?
Yes, Alakananda, we can see it.
So my topic is voicing the silenced, the marginalized other of the Brahmaputra Valley. The objective of my paper will be there. I'll want to show that there exists a remarkable resemblance between the nature of marginalization of the Dalits by a caste-administered Orthodox Hindu society and the anti-casteist caste exploitation of the aborigines by mainstream Assamese society and tribal groups. And again, the gendered life of the women of the tea community of Assam has rendered them doubly marginal, and they cannot be separated from the operative post-colonial state of the other, even when the whole community is even when the suppressed community is struggling to break free the stranglehold of yet another caste and exclusion. I'd like to open this argument with a few lines by Komal Kumar Tanti, a tea garden poet. He says, "Where did I leave my roots, my house, my heart, my village, my forest, Mednapur, or Barakuda, or Kalahandi?" And so, where? So the first half of the 19th century provided the British colonizers with a new commercial opportunities when Robert Bruce in 1823 discovered wild tea plants in the upper Brahmaputra valley. By 1333, the first tea garden of Assam was established in erstwhile district of Lakhimpur, and the state's socio-economic retardation and the local peasantry's aversion to the British workforce led to the migration of Adivasis from the neighboring states of Jharkhand, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, West Bengal, and Andhra Pradesh. As these indentured laborers settled around the tea gardens, and an interethnic conflict eventually stemmed between the indigenous inhabitants of the region and the more recent sons of the soil settlers. So, towards the end of 1850s, Tea Planters Association was established because the demand for laborers in the tea gardens increased all of a sudden, and it was established with the motive to regulate recruitment process of tea laborers in an organized manner. The recruitment was done through sardars or arkates, as is quite visible in Mulkraj Anand's Two Leaves and a Bud, where Gangu, the protagonist of the story, is brought from a village in UP to Assam by a Buta Sardar. These Sardars were sent along with a supervisor of the master race, that is one of the British official, to the poverty-stricken regions of mainland Indian peninsula to recruit poor Adivasis with false sense of better living and earning opportunities. Kidnapping of Adivasi women and sexual exploitation persisted throughout this period. These Adivasi women, once kidnapped and were brought to the tea gardens, were raped by British sahibs. And this fear and insecurity of these women is again projected by Mulkraj Anand in his novel, where this particular character, a tea plantation worker Nareen, warns Gangu, the protagonist, against Reggie, a British sahib who is shown to have an inclination towards the Adivasi girls and women. While there exists no first-hand narration of the exploitation inflicted on these aborigines by the colonial masters, the writers, prominent Indian writers of the mainstream Hindu society like Dwarkanath Ganguly and Ramkumar Vidyarathan symbolize the potent colonial and capital exploitation of the Indians in the tea gardens through the tragedies of the female workers who were often economically and socially abused. There is another prominent book written in the background of the colonial period and the condition of labors during colonial period, and it is by the Assamese author Orupa Potongia Kolita. The book released last year. It is titled Josnar Itihak. So Kolita, through her protagonist Durgi Bhumij, explores all the aspects of this socioeconomic marginalization and exploitation of women in the tea gardens. Durgi has traveled to the unknown with her husband, who soon dies, and then she is exploited by a tea garden British manager, by whom she bears 3 children. And eventually, when the manager leaves the country with their girl, Durgi is left alone to fend for herself and her 2 boys. So these aborigines toiled in the tea gardens and for generations, and have been exploited since then. These coolies during the colonial period were restricted within the confines of the garden under the supervision of chowkidars, and they were isolated from the rest of the society, and severe punishments were meted in case they tried to break free from the slavery. Wings of national struggle for independence couldn't properly embrace the ostracized community. And even though there are certain certain incidents of these coolies participating in the independence struggle, however, in most cases, they were undocumented and unrecognized. Like Durgi Bhumij in Josnar Itihak helps the starts leaking out information of British attacks on freedom fighters from the bungalow of the British manager. It is only through Durgi's help that the freedom fighters managed to disconnect the telegram lines and escape. However, her contribution remains unrecognized till the end. Now, coming to the present situation, for the mainstream Assamese society, the tea community has always remained the very much other, says Udayan Mishra, one of the leading experts of tea garden communities in Assam. The tribes of the state are categorized between autochthons and non-autochthons. Autochthon tribes in Assam are further divided into 23 scheduled tribes, out of which 14 are hill tribes and 9 are plain tribes. Now, according to an anomaly of the federal law, those who have been granted tribal status and privileges in the hills, if they come and settle in the plains, they would enjoy the privileges no more, and the vice versa. Now, non-autochthons are those tribal groups who were not the original inhabitants of the region, but migrated during the colonial period in search of livelihood and earning opportunities. This section of indentured ethnic population is recognized as tea tribes, deprived of ST privilege. Unlike their counterparts across the nation, they are deprived of the ST privileges on the basis that they are not the original inhabitants of the lands of Assam. However, they are classified under the OBCs and are divided into 96 ethnic groups. So there is a political dimension to this situation, because once and if they are declared under they are given the privileges of scheduled tribes, the whole power equation and politics of the state will go through a dynamic change. The mainstream Assamese conflict with the Tree tribe took a horrendous turn on 24th November 2007, when a brawl ensued in the streets of Guwahati, when a local youth on a bike injured an Adivasi woman and refused to take the girl to the hospital. Angry protesters of Adivasi Union took over the streets and smashed a few cars. Within minutes, a mob of local youth gathered and acted violently, representing a violent milieu of land mafias and surrendered insurgent runs syndicated, which controlled everything in the city. Smashing of cars by the newly arrived, quote unquote, newly arrived denizens was intolerable to the local Assamese population. Quickly they surrounded the T Adivasi protesters and beaten up anybody who remotely resembled a coolie. Lakshmi Orang, an Adivasi woman of Assam's T community, was chased through the streets and stripped naked and beaten just 100 meters away from the state's legislative assembly in broad daylight by some male members of the crowd thronging the state capital Dispur for rallying in her protests, tribes' protest against their social condition and the denial of tribal privileges. A naked Lakshmi kept running on the road begging for help, while no one came forward, and the educated mainstream local residents continued to laugh and deride her. It took a gallant and socially conscious yet uneducated young owner of a pawn shop to rush to the spot and cover her bare body with his shirt. This ever-going conflict between the mainstream Hindu local inhabitants and the more recent sons of the soil settlers originates from what Baba Saheb states as Hindus' obsession with caste, as if it is a precious possession that must be saved at any and every cost. The mainstream Assamese Hindu maintains that the Adivasis of the tea gardens are savages, and establishing a harmonious relationship with these hateful Anarias, quote unquote, would mean accepting them as their own. Therefore, while the tea tribes of Assam are somewhat assimilated into the Assamese national mainstream, these aborigines still continue to be marginalized. Kamal Kumar Tanti in his verse says, "We are told that historians call us other people. We are the stunted black sons of the soil. They are tall, white, flawless." The implication of cultural marginalization is intensified in the verse of the tea garden poet Kamal Kumar Tanti as he laments the loss of the language of indigenous aborigines under the thrust of the language of oppressors, which the tea tribe is forced to embrace. He says, "We are trapped in the coils in the damn delusion of language. We are language. Calm is still our language. Will we ever find our language and other language?" The conflict between the indigenous elites and marginalized subalterns has its root in the difference in composition between the two groups. Guha states that the first domain is characterized by forms of activity that are recognized as purely political. The other domain, as believed by some historians, has never been a part of established rules of politics, and their protests are often attributed to pure economic motives. Agrarian distress is accounted for their unrest. Subalternist believes that the rebellion of the tribes stems from not just out of their primordial urges, but this finds an expression in the religious beliefs and idioms of the aborigines. That is why rebellions of the marginalized tribes are often claimed to have been inspired by indigenous deities. You can see the picture of the cover book of Kamal Kumar Tanti's poetic anthology, Morongburu Amar Pita. Morongburu is a tribal deity from Eastern, followed by tribal groups of Eastern and Central India. This shows the migration in the country, and Tanti here laments the loss of indigenous roots and language, and the inspiration it provides, the character of Morongburu provides to the community as it struggles through rebellions to find a voice against the cultural and political exploitation. However, the whole marginalization doesn't only exist on the part of the mainstream Hindu community. The marginalized, these aborigines are also marginalized by other tribal groups, and this can be understood better in Periyar's context. Periyar divides the Shudras from the Dalits. Though according to the definition, Shudras are the lowest class of the Hindu caste hierarchy, but Periyar describes them as the intermediate other who marginalize the Dalits, who exploit the Dalits, that is the lowest strata of caste hierarchy, because they have this sense of relative superiority. So other tribal groups also have a relative sense of superiority over these aborigines because of their original roots in the land. The idea of labor in the tea plantation is feminized, and the tender fingers of women are considered ideal for the delicate task of plucking leaves. However, the reality is much darker. Nirmal Prabha Bordoloi, a very eminent Assamese poet, versifies this in her poem titled "What That Girl Plucking Tea Lives in a Tea Garden of Assam Said in Secret in Spring. With these my two slender hands I cannot push these two bushes to a place which has more shade, while plucking two leaves and a bird in sharp sunlight, my hands and face have become darker." Purnanda Kumar writes, from morning to late night, these women remain busy in the garden. They get up 4 o'clock in the morning, start cooking for their husbands and children, finish their early meals or breakfast, and report at 7 o'clock and start plucking leaves even in an inclement weather, with their little infants stripped on their breasts. They work relentlessly through the changes of the climate, and because of the brazen heat and the heavy showers, the skin of their finger peels off, but the mothers and the baby seeks shelter under an umbrella which barely provides protection to them. Besides, the female workers are engaged inside the main factory at various levels, and when they inhale this tea dust and polluted air, their respiratory system is affected and they suffer through different kinds of disease. At 5
Alakananda, you have 2 more minutes.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
So we can see the condition that these women go through on a daily basis. However, though these women constitute half the population of the workers in the tea gardens, they are still underpaid, underwaged, and they are malnutrited. And that is the reason the MMR, the maternal mortality rate among the women of the tea gardens is extremely high. Every year, lots of women dies from different diseases and during the birthing process. Now, owing to their non-status, the Adivasis of Assam are subjected to often violations and discriminations, violent clashes from the other tribal groups and the mainstream Hindu society, like the Bodo, Assamese and Karbi extremists. One of the incidents found representation in the eminent poet, tea garden poet Honanta Tanti's poem titled Savage. 27 persons were killed, among them 12 were men, the rest were women and children. Eyewitnesses say there were babies too, asleep in their mothers' bosoms. The villages were surrounded, the doors broken, and men were dragged from their beds. All 12 men were landless and without independence. The women were mothers of hungry children. The children were just children and flowers. So, this discrimination doesn't only come from these other communities, but also from
Alakananda, you can wrap up your because your time is technically over, so you can just wrap up.
Yes, ma'am, I'm wrapping it up. So, ma'am, even though there are different development projects going on in Assam, the conflict between the state and the Tea tribe comes into highlight when because none of these tribes become a part of development. They are just made to sacrifice in the name of development. Thus, the rebellion groups like the ones I have suggested here, the Birsa Commando Force and the Adivasi National Liberations have developed over time, not only to avenge the violence against them, but also to demand for their rights. And since the last 75 years of independence, these Assam's aborigines have been subjected to various forms of exploitations in the name of development of the nation. The ceaseless marginalization by the mainstream society has deeply fueled the tribe's existential and identity crisis. As a result, they are now crusading in their own literal and metaphorical war of independence against the exploitative system for a proper recognition within the system and the society, and poetry has become a medium through it. He says, "Hamder kotha babura likhen, hamra chup hoye boshe thaki, hamra nai bujhi bhasha o kobita babura bolen." So this idea is deconstructed by the tea garden poets. Now they have taken up pen and started writing about the conditions they are facing, the exploitations they are facing on an everyday life. Thank you, ma'am. That's it.
Thank you, Alakananda. Now, okay, we will have question answers by the end of the session. Okay, over to the last paper of this session by Anwesha. The paper is titled The Goddess Question, Casteist Bias and the Creation of the Goddess in Aruna Gokulamanda's A Dalit Woman in the Land of Goddesses. Anwesha is currently an undergraduate student at Presidency University studying English literature. Her areas of interest lie in contemporary Indian writing, both in English and translation. Over to you, Anwesha.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. The experience of womanhood and thereby feminism cannot be solidified into one unique identity under any circumstance because key to it is intersectionality. In the West, the concept of feminism was limited to the upper-class white women trying to be at par with the men, while the black women continued to struggle finding a voice. While in India, feminism became restricted to the upper class and caste that vested it for nationalistic causes. In fact, it can be said feminism in its true sense was hardly present. So the vital question of caste oppression and silencing of lower caste women was technically ignored. All women do not stand on the same platform because for the lower caste woman, she gets oppressed by men of all castes, as well as the upper caste woman. There is no institutionalized other for the lower caste woman. In every walk of life, she herself is being othered. Therefore, feminism became the voice of the different, and the burning issue to which these feminists devoted their energies to was the caste question. Caste becomes a strong marker of why womanhood cannot be a homogeneous experience. In fighting narratives of patriarchy, this difference becomes the key factor as it incorporates members from different caste, ethnicity, language, and so on. It is also important to note that caste speaks for a certain economic position and linguistic manifestation. Dialects and habits speak a lot about caste politics, for only the Savarna style of living or speaking is declared to be normative. Therefore, two features of this difference becomes crucial in an array of factors against the homogeneous patriarchal narrative of womanhood that we consider normative. First, it becomes a position of cultural feminism, giving feminists the right to define womanhood in an array of factors as against the homogeneous patriarchal narrative of womanhood that was considered normative. Secondly, it becomes a position of nominalism. This means that the idea of womanhood as a single entity itself is meaningless because this is the male narrative that has no consideration for these differences that become crucial for Dalit feminism. With the differences gone, there is no point of the resistance against Brahmanization because in India, the problem was not just that women needed to vote. It was important to ensure women included Dalit women too. Moving forward with Sharmila Rege's idea of different voices, the paper would try to explore how this difference becomes crucial in the representation of their goddesses as well. The role of the Dalit and the Savarna female bodies become essential to highlight the casteist bias in both representation and worship. The paper would also do a reading of Aruna Gogulamanda's poem, A Dalit in the Land of Goddesses, to show the position of Dalit women or goddesses, or if they at all can be so. The paper has three sections: the pattern of goddesses that Savarna and Dalits worship, and also how these patterns differ, if a Dalit can at all be a goddess, and how gender and caste controls it, and finally, as per the poem, what is the position of a Dalit woman in this land of goddesses. The Savarna goddess and the Dalit goddess. The idea of family or Shongshar is essential in the Indian context. But the normative definition of such an ideal is an upper caste family. In the Bengali context, it might mean having a matriarch that looks after the family and worships for their well-being. There are certain set practices like lighting incense at the tulsi tree or blowing conch shells in the evening that bring home the idea of righteousness and faith in God. In hardly any mythological text or folklore, we find this idea of Shongshar applicable to a Dalit or Adivasi family. But do they not worship goddesses, or do they have different ones? Before that discussion ensues, it is essential to realize how the goddesses in the broader Indian context are portrayed. For example, Lakshmi, or Lokhi as it is pronounced in Bengali, is the goddess of wealth and fertility. Additionally, a woman, in most cases a newlywed, is also reported as Lokhi or Lokhimanto if she is fair, soft-spoken, and expert in household activities and is demure. So the goddess figure becomes much more than an ideal to worship. It becomes an archetype that infiltrates into the lives of these people and replicates itself on its chosen models. However, interestingly, a field study finds that in families that worship Lokhi, they also worship Monosha, a figure that is merely a polar opposite who represents both eros and poison. Yet the archetype of Monosha does not infiltrate the members of the Savarna household. Monosha, the snake goddess, is a staple of the Dalits and Adivasis of Sundarbans who believe, like their own identities, their deities are marginal too. Their other central goddess figure is Bono Bibi, or the forest guardian. An important analogy can be drawn from the Monosha worshipping by the other caste. As per the Monosha Mongol Kavya, she resulted from an ejaculation of Shiva that did not go into Parvati. She shares his sovereignty over snakes and poisons. She embodies divine pleasures gone astray. She is sexually irresistible, beautiful, and manipulative, who controls the life and death of the population of Bengal, but is also kind-hearted. She is deserted by her father on account of her stepmother Chondi, even by her husband on her wedding night. Despite the fact that Chondi, the destroyer of demons, is worshipped by the lower classes, Monusha's figure as a Dalit woman here becomes more fixating. She is God's illegitimate product, as per the Savarna narrative. She is overtly sexualized, as is a Dalit woman, as will be discussed in the last section of the paper vis-a-vis Gogulamanda's poem, and she is definitely not accepted and in general a figure of malice and vengeance. On the other hand, Lokhi is Shiv's legitimate child, and her spousal relations with Vishnu are one of the strongest and most respected ones amongst the upper caste Hindus of Bengal. She is a wife, a mother, an object of management and procreation, but never with an ounce of expression for her sexuality. Both Lokhi and Monosha are the products of a patriarchal narrative, but the latter is a condemnation of everything gone astray. She is worshipped only because she is feared. She does not fit into the archetype of the motherly goddess, one that fights and also cares for. She is the outsider in the realm of goddesses. Yet, when read from a feminist perspective, one realizes she is the one to be idealized because she rises above her birth and pioneers the expression of sexuality. Moreover, she is vengeful for good. So that brings us to the next question. If Dalit women can at all be represented as goddesses, as Savarna women are. On another note, Itu Pujo, Ganga Devi, Machal Thakur, and Ma Shitala rituals are worshipped mainly by the Dalits or marginal Bengali households of Sundarbans. These religious narratives personify the hierarchized struggles of marginalized deities such as Monosha or Shitala trying to achieve social mobility amongst the eminent Hindu gods and goddesses, similar to Chotoloks aspiring to meld into the Bhadralok community of Bengal. Can a Dalit woman be a goddess? The Dalits often look for a ground of commonality amongst themselves that would help them fight against the greater narrative of caste violence, as well as benefit and liberate their community on a whole. In February 2011, BBC published a news that a new goddess has been born in India. She is the Dalit goddess of India. The Dalit community in Banka, Uttar Pradesh, were building the figure of an English goddess on a quest to traverse up the socioeconomic ladder. The bronze statue mimicked the Statue of Liberty, and Chandrabhan Prasad, who originally came up with the idea, said that she was the symbol of Dalit Renaissance. She holds a pen in her right hand, which shows she is literate. She is dressed well and sports a huge hat, which is a symbol of defiance that she is rejecting the old traditional dress code. In her left hand, she holds a book, which is the Constitution of India that gave Dalits equal rights. She stands on top of a computer, which means we will use English to rise up the ladder and become free forever, says he. So if the Dalit themselves were to make the narrative today, this would have been the ideal figure of their goddess as against the ones that were shoved upon them from which they're striving to break free. English is important for the Dalits because they believe Hindi benefits them in no way. To get a social standing, they need to fix their socioeconomic condition, and English is a must in the professional world. According to laborer Sarvesh Kumar, Dalits were never respected, and whatever little we have gained is because of the efforts of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. Ambedkar said English was the milk of a lioness. He said only those who will drink will roar, says Chandrabhan Prasad. He says with the blessings of goddess English, Dalit children will not grow to serve landlords or skin dead animals or clean drains or raise pigs and buffaloes. They will grow into adjudicators and become employers and benefactors. Then the roar of the Dalits, he says, will be heard by one and all. Therefore, the linguistic counterpart becomes crucial in any resistance. The Dalits needed a language for worshipping in which they were not oppressed because they created this model of worship for emulation. Interestingly, one does not find the upper caste Hindus coming up with the idea of such a groundbreaking goddess that at once upholds education, equity, and feminism because they benefit from an oppressive belief system that has continued for ages. It is true that the creation of a goddess to worship is not always progressive. Goddesses are archetypes created to stigmatize female desire and ambition. However, in this case, it clearly becomes an epitome of progress and a figure of liberation against the infusion of Puranic narratives. These serve the dual role of controlling the lower caste as well as the women through the instrumentation of the upper caste. This explains how class and patriarchy were interdependent in the process of exploitation. The underlying idea is that the goddess worshipped by the Savarnas or manifested essentially becomes an object of pleasure and prayer of patriarchy. On the other hand, the Dalit women, albeit sexually exploited, abused, and ignored, is a figure of resistance. She can never belong to the Lokhi archetype, not just because she would not be allowed due to her untouchable status, not because she does not have the economic stature to procreate or save wealth, not because in the conditions that she had to survive and rear her family, she would rather worship Shitala to save them from pox and monosha against death, rather than Lokhi for fertility, but because Lokhi will never be able to constitute a violence that she has to suffer from regularly. Lokhi is untouched. The Dalit or Adivasi woman is reduced to her genitals, made promiscuous, portrayed as prostitutes, and silenced vehemently by the gender other, who create the dominant narrative, and the caste other, who are its watchdogs. Moreover, she is even abused by the gender other of her own caste. She is at the lowest pit of the social structure, while the goddess of the Devi is diametrically opposite at the highest. She sits right at the top of the Shongshar and blesses it. Therefore, the question of difference becomes crucial in reading this womanhood and its divine counterparts. So, the answer to the question of whether a Dalit woman can be a goddess should be that they would rather not. If anything, they must incorporate Monosha's vengeance in their resistance to fight against their sexualized bodies and demeaned identities in adverse social positions. reading Gogulamanda's A Dalit Woman in the Land of Goddesses. Recent Dalit writers have taken up the Anglophone way of expressing themselves because English becomes a shared language. It derails the hegemonic practices that Sanskrit or Hindi poses. In both of the latter languages, Dalit mean broken or scattered. They are outcast and untouchable, in lieu of which they are perennially oppressed or excluded in society. They do not fit into the normative narrative. The Dalit woman, as already said, boils down to the lowest point in the social strata. She is considered as dirt and filth. She is a quota within a quota. She is reduced to her sexuality and sexual vulnerability because Dalit women are way more prone to exploitation than upper caste women are. So Gogulamanda employs satire at two levels in her poem. She positions this sexualized and exploited figure of the Dalit woman in a country that celebrates its women as goddesses. Secondly, she takes up this narrative in the English language as against the chauvinist Sanskrit sacred texts of Hinduism that employ discrimination. English as a language becomes a space for commonalities. Aruna Gogulamanda, a South Indian Dalit, comes from an Orthodox Christian family that is inspired by Marxist philosophy. She had been appalled by the lack of mention of caste violence in dominant narratives of feminism in the country. So she sources her poetry directly from experience. When she brings about the ghettos of Dalits, an important part that she throws light on is how the Dalit male figure is abusive. He dictates rules that the women need to abide by and control their lifestyles and sexual needs. My poems try to portray the ghastly treatment many poor Dalit women go through every day to make ends meet. The many, many atrocities against her that continue to this day in this country in the form of rapes, naked parading, and character assassination and domestic violence made me write about her. I wanted to depict the differences and the extreme difficulties of living with caste stigma in this country, said Gogulamanda. She further mentions how the Dalit woman, in most cases against an upper caste woman, is someone engaged in extreme physical labor due to her socioeconomic position, like in a construction site or an agricultural land. This physical labor exposes her to even more sexual and other kinds of abuse, for which she hardly has protection or the power of resistance. She is the stark naked figure of shame and pain in a country where goddesses must be fully clad, wear jewelry, and sit at the household hearth. The hypocrisy behind this narrative shows how the figure of the Dalit woman is othered on so many levels. She cannot be the archetypical goddess. The problem, Gogulamanda notes, surpasses economic boundaries. Her mother, a well to do homemaker, also had to suffer from shame and violence despite being up in the social ladder because of her Dalit identity. The key aspect that Gogulamanda talks about in her poem is the body of the Dalit woman, how it is represented, controlled, exploited in the land of goddess figurines. The exploitation of Dalit female bodies, worse than the exploitation of Savarna female bodies, because of their caste identity. A man belonging to the lower caste runs the chance of being more violated than his upper caste counterpart just because he is a Dalit, irrespective of sociopolitical standards. For women who are the victims of double silencing, this only becomes more intensified. The goddess identity is being subverted. The goddess, just like the Dalit woman, is watched as a device by men, but the latter cannot wear a blouse, thereby allowing her to be promiscuous. She has to keep herself a bait. She has to toil in the fields all day and work as a human machine without food and water. She is to be assaulted, insulted, and jeered at for being born a woman in a cursed clan, to quote Gogulamanda. Her man was her master. This accounts for the levels of silencing that occurs on her. A human machine, as Gogulamanda uses, becomes an extremely crucial term because she is being dehumanized. She is a slave to the master at work and to her husband at home for reasons that are only physical. The interesting corollary to this is that the goddess imagery also practically dehumanizes women. It is a male narrative created to attribute qualities they think are essential in a woman that should be emulated. Yet, in the dehumanization process, the attribution becomes wildly different. The upper caste woman is worshipped, the Dalit assaulted. Even if both are victims of patriarchy, the Dalit woman is more exposed to violence from every other level in the hierarchical structure. She has no entity in society. Gogulamanda writes that she is a bad woman, a bloody sanitary pad, useful but a disgusting topic. The relentless sun beats on her, her dreams, beauty, and youth, sacrificed in the service of the land, the hut, the master. As against her caste other, who is a goddess, she is a bad omen because she epitomizes all that is real in society, the real character of men who worship goddesses at home, the real face of violence in society that translates into her own personal shame. She is associated with topics that are disgraceful and forbidden to be talked about in connection with a goddess, like a sanitary pad with which Gogulamanda compares her. The Dalit woman is essential in the society for physical labor, for prostitution, for being the stone men pelt on to climb ahead, for being at the receiving end of every blame, but she is still a disgusting topic. She is avoided in broad daylight. She lives only to serve and sacrifices herself in a land where men worship women. This abject sexualization as the dual result of patriarchy and caste violence paints the real picture and reinstates why, rather than cannot be, the Dalit woman should not be a goddess. Gogulamanda writes, her calloused hands, her unkempt hair, her cracked heels, her wrinkled hair, tell the tales of living through years and years of centuries and millennia of violations and death. The appearance of the Dalit woman itself is indicative of why she cannot be a goddess. She is not fully clad, she is not beautiful, she looks ghastly because she has survived centuries of violations and deaths. She is a device for sex, for men at every level. She is being assaulted for sadistic pleasure. She is filth, dirt, and hence, Gogulamanda writes, in this sacred land of thousands of goddesses, she is called a Dalit. Therefore, the sacred land is the normative idea. The figure of the Dalit is not. She cannot be a goddess because she doesn't even fit into the social dictum of what a woman should be. She simply is a tool for physical labor and pleasure, while the goddess is a tool of prayer to save men against their deepest insecurities. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Anwesha. So with that, we conclude our 4 presentations. Just to briefly summarize what the presentations, all the very interesting papers focused on, the general theme of the entire panel was that of Brahmanical patriarchy and Dalit women, and all the papers addressed those concerns in multiple ways, starting from the different regional aspects to the different textual materials that we have had, and also the different genres. Now, the thing that strikes me the most, in terms of the conceptual understanding of Brahmanical patriarchy, is that whenever we are talking about identity or even structures or systems such as patriarchy or identity, we are looking at it necessarily in a very plural and at the same time intersectional manner. So the term patriarchy is not just a very universal homogenized concept. There are differences based on the idea of caste as coinciding with gender, and the ways in which things like Brahmanical patriarchy create different situations for upper caste women and Dalit women. And at the same time, we have also come across instances of how there needs to be a recognition of difference between women and Dalits as well. So there are different ways in which we see the divisions or the hierarchies functioning here. It's not just the binarism of man versus woman, it's also the binarism of upper caste woman versus Dalit woman, Dalit man versus Dalit woman, and so on and so forth. And this notion has reverberated throughout the papers that we have heard today. Now, to briefly talk on the papers as well, the first paper, Myths and History, the other side of Dalit feminist activism, basically posed an epistemological inquiry into myth and history, where Aishanee pointed out that the two elements, myth and history, should not be understood as absolute fixed categories, fixed in time, fixed in definition. In fact, through her analysis of myths pertaining to caste and gender, she brings to question the entire entity called history, and how that questioning contributes to a newer understanding of history itself. The second paper by Shashi basically focused on the autobiography as a genre and the contribution of experience, especially the idea of Sandra Harding in terms of feminist standpoint theory will also be very crucial here. So in the representational aspects, especially with reference to the Fulan Devi, or the Bandit Queen, her autobiography that she dealt with, we come to see the different ways in which the assumed or our assumptions prevail over the representations of a Dalit woman. The third paper, Voicing the Silence, took up a very interesting region, which is Assam, and the perpetual violence on Dalit women and Adivasi women. So I found this very interesting in the paper, that it brought into question the idea of women in tea estate, especially the tribal women. So it really brings to perspective the very interesting link between caste and Adivasi, or Dalits and Adivasi, because a lot of times these two are seen as two different, or maybe related but not necessarily interrelated entities. And also the idea of labor as feminized. Maybe I would like to Alakananda, if she is willing, she can talk a little bit more on how labor is feminized in this case. And finally, the last paper which we heard by Anwesha, once again strikes at the heart of the plural and the intersectional identity, and especially the theme of goddesses. So she deals with two goddesses, and she questions whether there even needs to be a parameter to judge Dalit goddesses at all, because those parameters are also very much influenced by Brahmanical patriarchal structure. And as we see, with the references that she has drawn from Gogulamanda's poems, these kind of hierarchies continue to persist. And she also highlights how the figure of the Dalit goddess can become a crucial element to challenge and become an alternative history in that way, going back to the first paper in that sense, to challenge the Brahmanical patriarchal ideologies. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for questions. So we have two questions here. The first question is from Aishanee Roy. I'm not sure who it is addressed to. So the question is, between upper caste, colonial and Hindutva narratives, history majorly voices society's dominant sections, the mainstream. Mainstream history then seems to be a collective of these voices. Does feminism and caste have a place in this mainstream history? Are they even seeking a place in that mainstream? I assume it is for Aishanee. Aishanee, would you like to address it? There is no mention about who. Yes.
Yes, ma'am, definitely. Ma'am, hi, Aishanee. What I want to say regarding this is that, yes, while mainstream, it is very much depends upon how you define mainstream and what constitutes it. If, like, the dominant narrative, what we get to know regarding the Dalit, regarding the society, feminism and caste, perhaps I personally feel that do not have a place in the mainstream narrative. For that purpose, we need an alternative history and a distinct voice of dissent. So I want to say one of Rajni Kothari's arguments in this connection. He points out that the Dalit women, owing to their own articulations and lived-in experiences, they produce a discourse of dissent, and that was essentially an alternative history, significantly different from the mainstream historiographical narrative. So perhaps I feel that in the mainstream overarching narrative, we do not have the place of feminism and caste taking their places.
Okay, Aishanee, thank you. I hope that has answered your question, Aishanee. We have another question for Anwesha from Shagor Das. While English is used as a shared linguistic space, is not the use of English as such is representative of the Dalit anxiety to be accommodated in the mainstream? In that case, doesn't it produce more alienated and hyphenated identities within the Dalit communities? Anwesha?
Yes, I don't disagree that English will not be hyphenating within the Dalit communities. The reason what I picked up English against Sanskrit or Hindi was that English does not English does not act as a language of oppression directly to the Dalit community on an entirety. That was my point. I had also mentioned inside the paper that the dialects and habits of Dalits, individual Dalits as communities, should also be given respect. So, of course, I think English will form more hyphenated communities. inside the Dalit community at large, but it still can act as an alternative as a meta narrative to Hindi or Sanskrit. That was my point.
If anybody has questions, they can raise their hand also and directly ask the presenters. Okay, so I had a question to Alakananda. Alakananda, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Alakananda. Alakananda, can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned that when women are going, especially in the tea estates, they are working, especially because of their nimble hands. You mentioned the term labor is feminized. So feminization of labor is one of the most crucial and probably one of the most talked about, research areas in feminist history, at least in India. So can you talk a little bit about how labor is feminized, how you are presenting that?
Ma'am, there is a division of labor that exists in the society with technological business or factory jobs. Those particular labors are often considered very masculine. Even today we say that men are better suited for science. So anything technological or at that particular area, everything is masculine. So now these women, there are certain in the tea garden, when the whole ground has to be plowed or the tea has to be planted, those things are particularly done by men of the tea garden, the men coolies. But women and children, small girls especially, were brought because their soft, nimble hands would be was considered to be very suitable for plucking the tea leaves. They would pluck two leaves and a bud, two leaves and a bud. It was kind of a rhythm that would go on, and they would be particularly restricted to that part of the job. Or even now, when we go to visit the tea gardens of Assam, we see people carrying these big baskets in their bag and plucking leaves. Hardly there are men in the garden who are doing that plucking work. It is the women who are made to do, because it is somehow, because maybe it is a patriarchal setup, society setup, some particular attributes, some particular labors are given to women over the time.
Okay, thank you, Alakananda. And in addition to that, another point I would also like you to think is that there also exists a wage gap between the two. So the moment labor gets feminized, automatically certain types of labor are considered feminine, like you pointed out. Plus, also it gives a scope to justify the wage gap that is also there. Yes.
Yeah, ma'am. There's a wage gap, and the women are doubly marginalized because they have to balance between working 13 hours a day in the tea field, tea gardens, and then coming home and walking miles for collecting the basic necessities of life, cooking and taking care of children. So that is the double marginalization.
Absolutely. And also that kind of labor goes unrecognized as labor or wage labor, like we have this huge problem of domestic work, of course. Okay, so any more questions? So Shourashri and Aishanee, Aishanee Pandey, do we have any questions from the YouTube channel also?
Ma'am, we just had one question that is from Aishanee Roy, and that's all.
Okay. Then in that case, if we do not have any further questions, we can end the session here. Yeah, okay. So I would like to thank all the presenters for very interesting and thought-provoking, papers. I enjoyed reading all of them, and for the listeners and speakers, also feel free to write to each other if you have any further questions as well. And I would also like to thank this conference organizers and Dr. Mandal for giving me the opportunity to chair this session, to be part of this wonderful conference. Thank you so much.